It is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Matthew Goodland. He is a geneticist by training and is passionate about using technology and innovation to create a more sustainable food supply. He currently leads sustainability at ABS Global, a world leader in genetic improvement. Matthew is responsible for ABS's overall beef and dairy sustainability strategy, including sustainability, product development, and positioning for the global bovine business to ensure ABS can continue to deliver more profitable and sustainable beef and dairy genetics to consumers around the world. Please welcome Dr. Goodland.
Okay, good morning. So I spent a lot of my time engaged in discussions really around the world about sustainable food systems. And I think I want to talk about three challenges that I think we need to consider when we're thinking about the global production of animal proteins, which I also think have resonance for the conversation that we're having really in this room and at this meeting around the production of US beef. I think the first challenge is we have a lot of people to feed around the world. So when we think about the current projections for global population, we're at about 10 billion people by the year 2050. And what's really interesting is over the last few years, the conversation has shifted from we need to produce more food to we actually need to produce better food. And so it's really that better food that we want that will allow us to address food security and improve human nutrition. And it's by focusing on quality of the calories more than it is focusing on the quantity of the calories. And of course, I think, animal proteins fit right into this discussion. But of course, we also have to do that in a sustainable way. And so really what the expectation is around the world is that we're going to use fewer resources, we're going to have lower environmental impact, and of course, from an industry perspective, we need to be able to do this in a profitable way. But I think we also have to understand that there are efforts in various parts of the world to encourage people to consume less animal proteins. And in fact, today, there is a fairly serious paper circulating in the UK that is recommending that British citizens reduce their consumption of beef and milk by 20 to 30% over the next few years in order for the UK to meet their 2045 climate targets, as well as offer any number of additional benefits to UK society. And so I think we have to really recognize that the social license, our social license to continue to produce and consume beef at the level that we do today is not necessarily a given around the world. And so I think it's really incumbent upon us to be able to demonstrate that animal protein production systems can be sustainable, but also, and probably more importantly, that animal protein production systems can be a net good to society. And so that's really what I want to run through today. I think the place to start is really talking about what is sustainability and how do we think about sustainability. So this is a picture on a slide that I took a few weeks ago at a conference at UC Davis, and this is a slide that Frank Mittlinger presented. And I like this slide for a few different reasons. The first reason is I think it's a very simple, but a really powerful way to think about sustainability in terms of stewardship, right? When we think about stewardship is caring for the land, caring for our animals, caring for our families, caring for our communities, right? That's stewardship. And I think that really represents what we think about, or what we should think about when we think kind of this all-encompassing term around sustainability. The other reason I like this slide is because this started off the conference. This is one of the introductory presentations to a conference that was to talk about methane and livestock production. Okay, and so I think really Dr. Mittlinger was attempting to sort of level set that yes, there are things that we need to do from a scientific standpoint, but we have to remember that there's this holistic idea that encompasses all of sustainability. And so then he talks about a few pieces that go into that discussion, right? First and foremost, it's about producer profitability. Producers have to remain profitable in order to be sustainable. But we can't forget about animal welfare, animal health. We have worker health and safety. We have food safety, and of course, we also have environmental impact. Because we know that anything that we do is going to have an environmental impact, including producing beef. And so I think a lot of times when we talk about sustainability, we tend to use that word interchangeably with the environment. But I think we have to take a more holistic view when we talk about sustainability, and certainly when we present sustainability as an industry. one of the things I think Frank left out was this concept of how livestock contributes to local communities. This is another slide from that same conference, and I promise the rest of my presentation is not going to be pictures of other people's slides, but I really thought that this was a good representation of this concept, and this was from the Meat Institute of Uruguay. And really, it's talking about the fact that livestock production in particular, agriculture in general, but livestock production in particular, really strengthens rural economies, and it contributes to culture, it contributes to heritage, it contributes to the strength of those communities. And again, I think that's not something that we talk a lot about when we talk about sustainability. We tend to revert back to that environmental discussion, but this is a critical part of this, of the conversation, right? There's a stat that something like 1 billion people around the world are actively engaged in agriculture, right? The world population is something like 8 or 8.5 billion. 1 billion of those people have some connection to agriculture. And so we can't forget that sustainability is also about communities. When we'll look at maybe a more formal definition, we have a definition from the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and I think this provides us some scope for how we think about sustainability and how we think about applying sustainable practices. And so USRSB talks about socially responsible, environmentally sound, economically viable, right? A product that prioritizes planet, people, animals, and progress. And again, I think this is a good all-encompassing way to think about sustainability and to really guide the efforts here in the US to both describe as well as measure the sustainable production of beef. Another way we can think about it, which I like, and I think is a lot simpler, is it's about producing more with less, right? And I think that's a fairly straightforward concept, and I think everybody would agree that that's a good thing. But it's about producing more with less while ensuring that we can continue to do that in the future, right? And I think that's an important concept. And really, this is another way for me to think about in terms of its efficiency, right? So it's, Dr. Lawrence talked a lot about efficiency yesterday morning. This is really how we think about driving efficiency, which ultimately drives sustainability. We want to think about, well, how do our cattle producers, how do ranchers think about sustainability? There's a really nice paper that's just coming out by Sarah Popotic and co-authors in Translational Animal Science that they went out and asked producers, they asked ranchers, how do you define sustainability? There's a lot of different information in the paper. I encourage you to go look at it, but they put together this word cloud. And what you can see here, that profitability is the biggest part of the word cloud. Which I think is important, but you can see words like herd health, you can see words like maintaining and stewardship and environment, right? So I think ranchers in the US are thinking about sustainability in that holistic way, right? Again, it tends to get drilled down to these sound bites, but when we look at it in practice, we're thinking about it holistically. And I think one of the questions they asked is, what are your top 3 reasons to adopt a new practice? And 3 of the things they said that ranked the highest were profitability, animal health, and the fact that the benefit outweighs the effort, which again, I think is really interesting. And so that's the rancher's view. I think the rancher understands, what is sustainability. Now, what does the consumer think about it? Again, so we heard yesterday morning from Dr. Carr. She had a lot of great information, a lot of great figures. This is a different look at kind of how consumers think about sustainability, but I think the outcome is essentially the same. So this is a survey that looked at consumers in China, the US, the UK, the Netherlands, and Germany, and they basically asked them, I think this was an unaided survey, they asked them, how do you define sustainability? And when we look at the top pieces there, the top pieces are around no antibiotics or hormones. They're around sort of how the animals are managed. And I need to point out, this is all animal proteins. This isn't just beef. And the pieces that came in the lowest were the environmental factors. And I think this agrees exactly with what Dr. Carr showed yesterday. So I think what we have is we have the fact that sustainability really is a fairly simple concept, but it's also pretty complex. And perspective really makes a large difference, right? The perspective of where I sit in the industry or where I sit in the supply chain is going to influence how I think about sustainability, how I think about the food I eat. And so I think it's really important that we recognize that we sometimes are coming at this from very, very different points of view. we also can't be scared about talking about sustainability and presenting really this concept of what is holistic sustainability. I think the key message, and we saw this again from Dr. Carr's presentation yesterday morning, that people want to eat meat, right? I think that was fairly clear. Americans, and this is a couple of years old now, but there was a survey done, I think by Newsweek or somebody, that basically showed people want to continue eating meat. Very small percentages of the population say they never eat meat. And so I think that's a given. I think that what we saw yesterday and what we've seen in any number of surveys, and again, this is a US survey, but we see this in other parts of the world as well. People want to continue to eat meat, okay? The other piece, which I think is really important, again, on Dr. Carr's presentation, she gave a great presentation, a lot of good slides yesterday, is that retailers want to continue to sell meat and want to continue to sell beef, right? Beef is an important part of that retail portfolio. The challenge we have, and this red circle here, and so what this graph shows is on the y-axis, it shows the percent of revenue, and on the x-axis, it shows the greenhouse gas footprint, right? So what it's saying is beef is an important part of the revenue generating piece for the retail, but of course, they've calculated it has an outsized impact on greenhouse gases. And again, I think we have to own that, we have to recognize that. When we look at charts of environmental impact for different products different food products across the supply chain, we see that beef typically sits at the very top. Right now, there are some caveats to that around the things that sort of offset that impact. But what the retailers are seeing is that they want to sell beef, it's important to them, but they know that there is this environmental footprint that they have to deal with in some way. And so for them, that makes them an important target for reduction. So when we think about reductions, when we think about emissions, not all of you may be aware sort of how we talk about this. When we talk about it in terms of scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Okay, so scope 1 emissions are emissions that come from your own operation. So whatever your operation is, if you're McDonald's, your scope 1 comes from the restaurants that you have, the offices that you have, those sorts of things. Scope 2 is typically reserved for energy production. So the electricity that we use goes in scope 2. And then scope 3 is everything that exists within your supply chain. So typically that's your upstream supply chain. So again, if you're McDonald's, the emissions that come from the beef that you produce sit in scope 3. So everything that happens before that beef is sold as a patty in your restaurant, that goes to your scope 3 emissions. There's also downstream emissions, which I'm not going to talk about much, but it's everything that happens after you actually sell that product. And so what we know is that retailers have really grabbed onto this idea of scope 3 emissions, and they've set really aggressive targets. And so most global companies, and I say here about 80% of public companies, have some sort of target for scope 3 emissions, and most of them, that's what the left graph is showing there, that long bar, most of them have a target to reduce their emissions by some amount by 2030. And so that's the place that everybody's running towards. We're now, and a lot of them set these 5, 6, 7 years ago, when 2030 was a long way out. 2030 is getting much, much closer, right? So we're now 5 years out from 2030. And so there is a urgent interest from our supply chains, our food supply chains, to figure out how they address these scope 3 emissions. And why that's important is you can ignore most of the graph and really just look at that last bar. What this shows is this is particularly for a beef supply chain. This is some interesting work that McKinsey did. For a beef supply chain, what percentage of the emissions are scope 1, 2, and 3? And that red bar is showing that for an average retailer, and I think we use the word retailer, I think in food service as well. For an average retailer, 86% of their emissions sit within scope 3 upstream. Another 10% exists in scope 3 downstream. So 96% of their emissions are sort of out of their direct control. And so that's why there's such an interest in these scope 3 emissions, because they've got these targets to reduce their emissions, but most of it, very large portion of it, comes from systems where they don't have direct control. And so they have to figure out, how do I incentivize my supply chain to bring me solutions, to bring me interventions that allow me to claim reduced scope 3 emissions. And so really, I think the place we've gotten to today is that product sustainability attributes are increasingly critical for animal source proteins all around the world. Right, we've just got done talking about the comprehensive nature of sustainability, how we talk about sustainability and all the different components of sustainability. But ultimately, the big focus right now is on that environmental sustainability, right? Because that's the place that retailers really globally have decided to focus. And so we have to make progress in environmental impact. And when I say environmental impact, there's a lot of different ways we can think about environmental impact, but ultimately they're thinking about carbon, right? And they're thinking about carbon emissions. And they're trying to figure out how do we reduce our carbon emissions in our supply chain. But we have to do that without having any impact on these other elements as well, right? We can't impact animal health, can't impact welfare, because we already saw that's what consumers care about. That's what they think sustainability is. So we can't have worse welfare. We can't impact profitability because our supply chain still has to be profitable, or we won't get our products. We can't impact the nutritional quality of our product. And so we're having to address this environmental impact without changing anything else. And that's obviously a key challenge. And so I'm going to argue that credible sustainability practices are going to enable our continued social license to produce beef. And I'll probably take a bit of a step further and say, I think there are instances where the credible sustainability practices are going to allow us access to markets that we may not otherwise have access to in the future. But I think the other way we need to think about it is, Frank Bittlinger uses sort of this carrot and stick approach. We don't want to look at this as a stick. We need to look at this as a carrot, right? This is an opportunity to create value for our products that have certain sustainability attributes, right? We know that we've done a lot of good work as an industry over many, many years. And so it's really, how do we position that? How do we talk about that? How do we package that? So that we have something that can create more value for the producer, for the supply chain, and then ultimately meets the needs of that retailer or the supply chain stakeholder. So how are we doing that, right? So I talked a little bit about the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef already. We have the Global Roundtables for Sustainable Beef, and there are 24 different efforts around the world that are really looking at building the frameworks and building the processes for how we, one, define sustainability, but then how do we talk about it? But how do we make change at the local level, right? So it's not this global organization saying this is what has to happen. It's this global organization that's supporting the local organization to make changes in their markets, in their regions, and in their countries. Because ultimately it's the national roundtables that know what's best for their particular market. But what the global roundtable is doing is really advocating at the global level for sustainable beef production, for beef production in general. Because there's a lot of conversations happening at that global level about how do we reduce the consumption of beef? How do we reduce the impact of agriculture? And so this is an organization that's really working at that international level to advocate for essentially for what we do, for our livelihoods. I think another interesting thing, this is a report that just came out this last fall. You don't need to see any of that, but I just wanted to show it, to demonstrate. This is a report that looks at both data and technologies that are driving sustainability in the beef industry. So what you can see is there are a lot of things out here, right? And what's interesting about this report is what's interesting is what's missing from this report. So they talk and they acknowledge very freely that genetics is a key part of that sustainability conversation, but they actually don't recognize it as a technology for driving improvement. So genetics doesn't really show up here in any of these boxes as a technology that we can use to create a more sustainable beef supply. And so I think that's our opportunity, because I'm going to argue over the next few slides that we actually have the technology, we have the genetics that will allow us to create more sustainable beef systems and to be able to credibly demonstrate that. And so I'm going to argue that genetic intervention is the most important practice for permanent reduction of environmental impact from livestock production. And I don't think I'm very bold in saying that. Genetics, and I say genetic intervention here, and what I'm talking about here is, yes, genetic improvement, but it's also how we disseminate and how we implement genetics into the production system. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. So it incorporates kind of all aspects of genetics, but we all know that the genetic changes that we make are cumulative and permanent. And there aren't any other technologies that are gonna be cumulative or permanent that can have the impact that genetics can. And so the work that we're doing in this room and in other rooms really is the most important thing we could be doing, to create more sustainable food supplies. And I think we have to recognize that there are absolutely new technologies out there. And I think Jason Archer is gonna talk to us about some things that they're doing in New Zealand. And we should invest in that. But the tools that we already have are really valuable, and we need to make better use of them. So, kind of some of my evidence for how we are, what we've already done. I just pulled these, from the association, from the Simmental Association, look at, what our genetic trends over time have been for beef production, right? I don't need to convince this room. We've made genetic improvement for traits that impact beef production. I think that's a given. And so what's the outcome to that? What has that been? These are, on the left is essentially cattle or beef per animal, from 1990 to 2023, and milk per animal from 1990 to 2023. So again, I don't think I need to convince anyone in here that we've made tremendous progress in productivity. When you look at these graphs, say since 1950, the progress is even steeper, but we've made tremendous progress in efficiency. We produce way more pounds of product per, way more product, way more pounds of product per animal than we ever have before. And frankly, that's been with less overall cattle. Okay, so we've taken, and a lot of that is directly derived from genetic improvement, right? There's obviously other things that go into that. There's nutrition, there's management, and those sorts of things, but a lot of that has come because of the genetic improvement that, folks like you in this room have made. Okay, and so then when we look forward, we think, okay, well, it's not just us, it shouldn't just be us talking about genetic improvement, right? So the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, put out a report in late 2023 that looked at, okay, if we want to reduce environmental impact of global food systems or global protein systems, what are the areas that we think we can address in order to do that? And so they looked at a number of different areas, and what they concluded from all the study that they did was that there are these different areas that will provide a significant reduction in global emissions. And I pulled out 4 of them that have implications from a genetic improvement standpoint. So we've got productivity is the biggest one. We've got breeding, which typically just encompasses direct selection for reduction in emissions. Then we've got rumen manipulation and improved animal health. There's a genetic component to all of these pieces. Obviously, genetic improvement is driving productivity. There's some work being done, and I'll talk very briefly about kind of on genetic control of the rumen, as well as obviously we can improve animal health through genetic improvement. So genetics really contributes to about 50% of the interventions that have been identified to have an impact globally on reducing the environmental impact of animal proteins. Okay, so I think we've seen the evidence that the genetic improvement can be very powerful. I think we can talk about that in a very credible way. And then I think we're seeing here the FAO putting out, hey, yeah, genetics is really a key part of this. And this is really, 2023 is really the first time we started talking about genetics as a key solution to more sustainable food systems. The challenge that we have, and the challenge that we've always had, is that dissemination of that improvement is really difficult. We know we can make genetic improvement. We know we can select for the traits that are going to impact food production and lead to make progress. But how we get those distributed around the world, very challenging. Global use of AI is very low. It's going to be less around the world. I said less than 5%. I don't know what the exact number is. But I think what we have to recognize is that there are gains possible from both emerging and existing technologies that we haven't fully realized. And I think that's a key challenge that we have to overcome. And so when I talk about these technologies, I'm talking about things like very, simply, and not so simply, things like AI, reproductive management, mating strategies, right? Are we putting the right genetics in the right cow in order to meet the needs, in order to meet our needs as a producer, but also in order to meet the needs of the supply chain? Are we collecting the right data? Are we leveraging sex? No, I don't think in the beef industry, really anywhere in the world, have we really leveraged the power of sex and what that can bring us from productivity gains. Targeted breeding programs. Are we able to target our genetic selection to supply chains or to markets or to specific outcomes for the entire chain. And then, of course, there's gene editing, which I'm not going to talk much about, but this is certainly a powerful tool that can be used in very specific ways. But ultimately, we have to be able to scale these solutions in order to fully realize the benefits. And that's been one of our challenges. Because again, we're talking about from a global perspective here, right? Because ultimately, everything is. And so we have to figure out how we do that in different ways in different markets. And so, I'm going to talk about just one example of some work that we've been doing, where we're sort of putting together these ideas of, okay, let's leverage AI, let's leverage sex semen, let's leverage mating strategies, let's leverage targeted breeding programs, let's leverage kind of enhanced phenotyping to create a specific product for a specific need with a specific outcome, ultimately, that we can describe as having a lower environmental. And so this is an example from beef on dairy. And I recognize that there are some advantages to beef on dairy, use of AI in dairy herds being probably the biggest. But again, I think it's a place that we can start to look at how these approaches work and how these approaches can be applied, and then figure out how we apply them in other production systems and other markets. And so, we've created a targeted breeding program specifically for beef on dairy, and this is an example in our UK system. Where we're able to collect different types of data, right? We're able to collect diet data, we're able to collect rumen composition, okay? We're able to get individual animal feed intake and water intake. We're able to look at enteric emissions, both in a green feed as well as full animal emissions. And this is allowing us in this particular system to create sort of a holistic view on what a genetic improvement program can and should look like for a beef on dairy system. And again, specifically, this is for the UK, but we're doing very similar work here in the US as well. And so this is part of a large scale project that we've been working on, again, in order to describe what's the impact of genetic improvement on some of these metrics that we talk about from an environmental impact point of view. And so as part of that, we're also looking at the microbiome. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. I think there's some talks later today on that. But we also see, again, as we talk about sort of this idea of enhanced phenotypes, we see the rumen microbiome is sort of an amazing thing. And we know that the rumen microbiome has impacts on virtually all traits that we want to measure. But in particular, we know that there is host genetic control over that rumen microbiome. And we've known that for a while now. And what that means is we can traditionally select an animal for the composition of its microbiome. And then that allows us to essentially bring more information to the table about things like feed efficiency or even things like methane production. And so what we're working on today with a partner in the UK is looking at how do all those things relate, right? How do all those things come together? Because we see the possibility for the microbiome to be, a bit of a step change in terms of allowing us to really accelerate that genetic progress. And so we think this is something that's going to be really important going forward. And then I think, so we kind of put all that together, and really the way we think about this is, okay, we've got these targeted breeding programs. We can implement them in beef on dairy systems in different parts of the world. We know we can make genetic improvement. So it's really the next step for us. Again, going back to the idea of creating credible sustainability attributes for products, right? The next step for us is to understand, okay, we can show you the genetic improvement. We can show you the improvement in feed conversion. We can show you the improvement in growth and the improvement in carcass traits. But what about environmental impact? Okay, so we're driving for improvements in profitability, but we also want to understand, okay, you as a producer and you as a supply chain are going to be more profitable, but then from a retailer standpoint, they want to understand what's the environmental impact. Okay, so again, this is work we've done in the UK. We've replicated this work in the US. We just haven't released the results yet. But we have 2 genetic lines that we market in the UK, and we've looked at them. Again, we've done all that measurement that I've talked about, and we've created a life cycle assessment. So a life cycle assessment is essentially the gold standard for how you measure the environmental impact of really any product across its entire life cycle. Okay, and so we looked at, if I have beef on dairy genetics, I'm gonna inseminate a dairy cow, I'm gonna get a beef on dairy calf, I'm gonna produce that animal across the supply chain, I'm gonna harvest that. And so we looked at, the entire product life cycle, but one of the things that was different and hadn't been done before, at least in bovine, was we wanted to account for the genetic merit. So we wanted to specifically account for genetic improvement in that life cycle assessment, in that LCA. Okay, and so the reason we want to do that is we want to be able to demonstrate that genetic improvement can drive reduction in environmental impact. Again, I think we all know that intuitively because we see that, right? We see the productivity increases, we see the efficiency increases, but we needed to be able to demonstrate that in a way that is credible and defensive to a retailer. And so in order to do that, we need an LCA. And so we spent a year essentially building this LCA with a third party vendor. And what we found in the end is that when we take all the other pieces away, when we account for management, we account for herd year season type of all the different effects that we account for in a genetic evaluation, what we found is that we could attribute about a 5 to 9% reduction in environmental impact due strictly to genetic improvement. So when we looked at the best genetic animals, they were 5 to 9%, had 5 to 9% lower environmental impact. Okay. And so, that sounds like a bit of a small number, compared to other numbers that you see out there. What I like to remind people is, one, this number is cumulative and permanent. So this 5 to 9% I see this year, this 5 to 9% I'm gonna see next year, and 5 to 9% I'm gonna see the year after. So if I look across 5 years, I'm looking at 30 to 40% reduction in environmental impact. That starts to become a really important number. And so when I say environmental impact, we're measuring this as carbon dioxide equivalents per kilogram of product produced. So we're looking at essentially carbon intensity here. And so again, what we can do with that then is have a credible number for what genetic improvement does for environmental impact. And I think this is a mechanism, and this is a way that we can start to create more value for our products, as well as ensure that we have market access. Because I think market access, specifically in certain parts of the world, is going to become more and more difficult when we don't have these sort of sustainability attributes. We do a lot of work in the UK, and so I tend to sometimes come at this a bit from a UK mindset, because the UK is a very different place than we are here in the US in terms of how we think about beef production. But I think in lots of different parts of the world, these sustainability attributes are going to be really important. And again, this is an opportunity for us to create more value for these beef products and open up markets for these beef products. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of where do we go? Like what are some of the conclusions here? What do we do to accelerate adoption of innovation? So I think the first thing we have to continue to say is that sustainability requires profitability. There are certainly some markets where we're seeing different levels of government support to go specific directions, but in most markets, producers still have to be profitable in order for any new practice to be adopted. And so I think we always have to keep that top of mind. We also have to think about, we need to incentivize the right behavior through supply chain signals. Right, we all know that the lack of integration in most beef supply chains around the world are really challenging, right? To send those right pricing signals back to the people who are actually making the genetic improvement. And I think the development of some integrated supply chains, in some cases are going to be a benefit here, and that's where I go next, right? So these integrated supply chains are able to create more value because they can send those signals back. We need to continue to invest in innovation. So don't hear me as saying, well, we've got all the tools, we need to focus on what we have and really drive that. We need to continue to invest in new innovation, because that's what's going to help drive us forward. But I'm going to argue strongly we have not made full use of the tools that we have today. Right? I think there's huge opportunities, even within our US production system, to make improvements using the tools that we have. we need to overcome barriers to disseminate genetic improvement. We know that all genetic improvement is not going to be disseminated through AI around the world. I think that's not a realistic assumption. And so how do we drive the right decision making, and how do we disseminate the genetics, in bulk, to where we need it to go around the world, and what does that look like? And then finally, we need to implement targeted improvement programs and mating programs for economically relevant traits, right? We need to focus on the traits that are driving value. And I think we know what those are for the most part, right? But then we need to look at how we create the right mating systems to make sure we're optimizing selection for those traits, right? So, the idea of having a terminal mating program versus a maternal mating program, and how do we optimize that to ensure we're making the progress that we need for our own supply chain and our own profitability, the supply chain profitability, but then also that ultimately that translation to a sustainability attribute. So I think, as I wrap up here, I think there continues to be tremendous opportunity to use genetic innovations to drive efficiency and sustainability of the beef supply chain. Okay, to me, I think that's a given. I don't think we should look at this as, there is something being done to us. I think we should look at this as there is an opportunity for us to create new product attributes for our product that are going to create value across that supply chain. You're going to, we have to keep in mind the things we're selecting for to reduce environmental impact are the same things we're selecting for to be more profitable. Okay, it's really about the translation of that productivity and efficiency over to reduce environmental impact. And I think supply chain stakeholders are looking for a story. They're looking for a credible story, a story that has evidence that we can create a more sustainable beef product. Right? I mean, there's a lot of ideas within that supply chain about what sustainability means and what beef production means. But I think really they're just looking for that story with evidence that they can grab onto, and that will basically, essentially, our executive director of Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef has a thing he says that, basically people just want to feel okay about eating beef. And retailers just want to feel okay about selling beef, right? And we sit in this room and we think, wow, they should feel okay about it, right? But sometimes they don't. And so it's incumbent upon us in the industry to help them make them feel good about eating beef and about selling beef. And I really think that's our opportunity as an industry to leverage these genetic tools to kind of, continue to drive forward to create the sustainability attributes that they're asking for. I think there's more value to be had and more value to be shared around the beef supply chain. And I thank you for your attention. Am I taking questions, Bob?
Yeah,
okay. Here.
React as a one. So you use twice to say meat production for animal. This is the best for land.
Yeah. So I think the question is, what's our metric for sustainability, right? So I talked about it in terms of environmental impact per kilogram of beef produced. Jeremy is asking, is a better metric around land use. And the answer to the question, Jeremy, is I don't know what the right metric is. But I think what we've done and the way we've thought about it is, kilograms of reduction per kilogram of product is sort of a standard thing that people can get their head around. And in some situations, I think the land use piece might be more complicated. And so we've chosen to think about it in a term that's sort of easier for people to understand, but that doesn't mean that's the right metric to work on.
The second moment is, I know everybody talking about the issue, but
in Carol, the carbon that the cow is emitting has been captured by the plant before, so it is a cycle, right? So is it fair to just measure how much emission when you compare to someone taking an aircraft to go to Florida and see the Mickey Mouse?
I think that's a great point, right? And I chose not to get into that because I'm not, you know, I'm not a, that's not my lane, Jeremy, but obviously it's way more complicated than just emissions, right? And it's way more complicated than just beef emissions, and you can look at the numbers and these often get distorted, but yeah. Industry and travel is gonna far dominate what is produced within animal protein spaces, and that's fine, but for me, in almost some ways, it doesn't matter, because we can sit there and have that argument all day long. But what matters is what's being asked of us by the supply chain, and we can choose to push back and say, it's not our problem, it's not our problem, it's not our problem, or we can say, it's not our problem, but however, here's a solution that's going to meet your needs while still optimizing for profitability across the supply chain. I think that's how we've chosen to look at it, or how I've chosen to look at it is, let's do what we know is right for our production systems, while at the same time demonstrating that what is right is actually good for the beef supply chain.
Matthew, I've heard the presentation by the folks at Athian, I think is how you say it. They've already stood up a system to benefit dairy farmers for implementing practices. And I think they have an intention of moving toward beef cattle, but that's in my head, the framework I'm asking this question from is, do you see a path forward where, you know, a certain number of practices or interventions can be put on a menu that producers actually receive compensation for beyond just soil carbon credits?
Yeah, and I think that's where we're going, right? Yeah, so APN has been working in the dairy space. They're working on creating essentially insect credits. I hate to use the word credit, because it's not the same as a carbon offset credit, but they're working to create insect credits within specific supply chains. They have sort of, you know, analysis they're gonna spend some time with them on dairy as well. But yeah, I think that's where the opportunity sits, right? Because the retailers in particular, but key stakeholders along the supply chain are looking for claimable carbon reductions. And so I think there is an opportunity to develop claimable carbon reductions within a beef supply chain that can incentivize, that can, you know, provide value back to the producer for creating those reductions. And yeah, there are, you know, there's soil carbon work, and there's all sorts of those sorts of things. But I think there are things that we're already doing that we can now quantify that are going to create value for some sort of insect credit across the supply chain.
Hey, Matthew. Question on the responses that you shared from the UK Bovine program. Just curious what the responses were for on performance traits, so milk production, whatever you might imagine from a performance standpoint.
So the boundary of the LCA, Tom, is really from the insemination of the dairy cow, and then following that calf. So insemination of dairy cow, calf is born, and then follow that calf through the supply chain. We haven't looked at the dairy trace, but what I can say is work that's been done, there's no evidence that the genetic improvement that we make in the beef on dairy supply chain has had any negative impacts on the dairy side of it. But that was outside the scope of the work that we did.
All right, do we want to give Dr. Cleveland one more round of applause? Thank you so much.